And we're recording. And I'm going to mute myself. Thank you, Eduardo. Here we go, Eduardo. Please make sure to keep yourselves muted, everybody else.
Hey, thanks, everyone. So I want to kick off things by quickly introducing Mobomo. Basically, we're a full-service DevOps agency that provides solutions for federal agencies as well as commercial organizations. And we create elegant solutions that focus on design and usability to solve complex problems. I'm Eduardo, and I'm the QA director for Mobomo. My job is to basically improve quality assurance standards company-wide. And on my free time, I love spending time with my dogs. I actually have 2 great greyhounds. They're awesome. And I'm here today to talk to you a bit about planning your Drupal QA. We're gonna go through a brief introduction and what got me to pitch this presentation in the first place. Then we're gonna talk a bit about why Drupal is challenging for QA and some tips and tricks on planning QA effort. We're gonna follow up with a conclusion. So to start off, I wanted to point out that QA is often overrated. People usually think develop first and test later, and that approach works. It's not something that is undoable, but when you go through this presentation, hopefully you will get to take a closer look at the testing effort early on, so that then you never get to see Drupal as an actual monster. So first off, QA has to do a lot of tasks outside of what we should consider testing. There's a lot that goes into reporting, into following up with the communication channels, making sure everything is working smoothly, reporting, sometimes including demos. So it's more than just testing. And sometimes there are things that are difficult to plan for, like finding the same issue a couple of times. There's the legendary feature hitting as a bug. Sometimes there's an issue blocking your testing efforts that needs fixing and it's not in the current sprint. So then there's a whole thing over what should happen on those situations. And sometimes deployments don't go as planned and you have sort of downtime where there's nothing to test and you're just burning out time. So what I did here was we had a great experience of working with amazing partners, experienced clients, and that sort of helped us grow up a highly skilled set of assets of people that are knowledgeable on working in Drupal projects. And even in that scenario, planning QA for those projects is just it's not easy at all. There's a lot that goes into assuring quality for a Drupal project, especially because most of the time requirements are quite complex, they're weird, and the issue is in a lack of requirements is not as easy as finding a bug. There's nothing broken that is evident to the person going over it. So having said that, let's talk a bit about what specifically about Drupal is challenging for QA. And I'm not a crazy conspiracy scientist trying to defame Drupal. I actually like Drupal. I like it a lot. I don't consider it a monster at all. But it has some specific qualities that if you don't keep track of them, they can be tormenting for QAs. Waking them up during the night because certain scenario was not tested or a user permission was not checked. So let's see the 2 biggest challenges that Drupal brings to the table. The first one is estimating effort. Estimating effort for QA is already a hard thing. Let's start there and try to see why Drupal makes it a bit more challenging. So usually you have a task that needs to be completed and then some sort of quality control over it to just make sure everything is fine. Let's picture a ticket to make it an easier representation of what needs to happen. So usually the developer works on it and the QA needs to test it. There are a couple of questions as to how much time you should account for a certain functionality that has been developed. Should you include partial regressions? Should you include going over stuff that is connected, so proximity testing, and just make sure everything is still sound? What happens if you find any bugs? Should you account for any bug fixing or just the time it takes to raise bugs? And what happens if the testing fails and you need to reopen the ticket and further work on it and then challenge it again to try and make sure everything is fine again? Should you account for all this time? And even then, after reopening and fixing it once again, there might be a chance for additional bugs to appear. So this is quite a complex thing to just set from the beginning. Now, if you take into account Drupal and how that impacts into this sort of estimation system, when you talk about developing functionality, Drupal delivers a lot faster than any other sources of any other technologies. Basically, you add modules and you stack modules. You might even add a module just because of a single piece of functionality within it, and you still have a lot of things that have been brought into the system that need to be handled, which makes the testing go, require more testing to go over the entire thing. So it's kind of like a double-edged sword. One other thing that makes the job a little bit difficult when it comes to estimation is when you do find bugs, it is kind of a difficult situation because the change might have introduced in a piece of content or a module, and it actually impacts something that's way connected, or there's a relationship further down the line. So the QAs need to put additional effort into trying to explain what's happening in detail so that the developer that then gets that ticket or that bug or that issue or the problem will have more information to work on it. This also adds on when there needs to be a reopening or there's a problem with the requirements that either they need to be changed or they need to be fixed. When there is a change, usually there's not just one thing that changed, but a lot. So the time it takes to actually fix it is greater, and the time it gets to test it again is greater as well. The last thing that can actually hurt the whole thing is basically going into custom modules. Drupal, in essence, is a very stable platform. There's not a lot of chances to get crashes or blockers. But when you go into custom code, just anything can happen, and you sort of lose that this positive factor of Drupal. So all in all, estimating effort is difficult by itself, and Drupal kind of increases that challenge. And the theory states that you should always estimate for the worst case scenario, but in most cases, and especially for QA, it's not possible. You need to just understand how far you're going to test or what your testing practice is going to imply. Following on that, the second thing I want to talk as a bit challenging for Drupal is how do you test the changes that development team introduces into the system? So basically, development has a very fast pace, as we mentioned, and requires additional QA to support that pace, which means that you're going to always try and test things as fast as possible, assuring quality, but trying to move as fast as possible as well to keep up. And since modules are kind of interconnected, or flows, it's closely related to user flows, there's a lot of things that are related to the change. So time for proximity testing is increased. And since functionality stacks real fast, if you ever need to stop and do a regression over the platform, you need to have some sort of system, because going over functionality that might be in the system could take days. So that needs to be efficient as well. That picture that during that time, you stop having great support for the things that are being actively developed. So as a solution, and this is actually the only solution for handling effort in QA, is planning. Planning is the best ally for QA. And in order to do this, I'm going to introduce something that if you don't have, you should get real soon, which is defining a test plan. A test plan is basically the description of what is going to happen as far as QA effort. It includes everything that will happen from start to finish, from beginning to delivery date. And it is super useful to define a lot of things about the project. The most important thing is this document will share the testing approach and scope for the project, and it will help you set the expectations for all your stakeholders. This is not only the client, but all the members of the team. So what the development team can expect from QA, what the PM should expect from QA, and what the client should expect from QA, together with any other parties involved with the project. So for example, the PM will receive reports, the dev team will receive bug tickets with a certain structure and certain information. And all pieces of information that are relevant to talk about and defined from the beginning of the project should be included in the test plan. And the test plan looks something like this. There's like 3 stages. The first one, you create the document, you define the scope, the timeline, and any other aspect of the project that you're going to be keeping track of. Then there's the execution period where you actually act upon what you said you were going to do. And at the end, you have a reporting phase where you create all the artifacts that have been introduced in the test plan as deliverables, usually a test report, something like a known issue and bug report, and then you move forward. And when you should start doing this, as soon as possible. If possible, during the discovery or the pitching of the project, you can still start taking notes and create a draft test plan where you put everything into it, and then the only thing you need to do is, tailor it on, you have kind of half the battle won. So once you have a test plan, that basically helps you understand what you're supposed to be doing throughout the project, and at that time you will see if it makes sense as far as time, budget, and effort. It also helps understand expectations because there's so much you can do or so much time you can put into a project to test it. So you need to be intelligent about how you assign that time. Now, this is the first tip for specifically for Drupal is usually the Drupal projects take a lot of time and are kind of different. There are different phases. Let's picture a migration requires, moving stuff from one place to another environment, migrating modules. There are different stages. There's usually a go live period of it. So a good idea is to break up this plan into 2 separate documents, a test plan and a test strategy. And the difference between those 2 is that the test strategy describes elements common to all the testing efforts. So basically everything that you should not repeat yourself on these different stages. And the test plan is actually focused on the actual testing effort that is being carried out right now. So they go into the detail of the system or the feature in particular and define what to test, how to test, when to test, and who will test at a low level of detail. So you go into the scope deeply. How this looks like is like so. There are 2 options. If you have like a test plan, you would have a single section that talks about strategy. When you go this other route for bigger projects or higher lifespan or high complexity projects, you have an overarching test strategy that covers them all, and then smaller specific documents that target each of the phases of the project. And these phases, can be named and might have nothing to do with actual sprints. They can, but they might as well not. They are related to milestones within the project. A quick example would be you're migrating and upgrading to Drupal 9, for example. So the first thing would be like the first version would be to migrate everything and see, what modules need to be changed. Version 2 would be completing all the functionality that needs to be additionally worked on to get to the same status, but in Drupal 9. And then any additional designs would be version 3. And then the final test plan will target the go live of the environment, making sure that everything is working fine. And this is just an example, but you can see how these milestones are not related to actual sprints, but more like functional clusters that get completed or particular dates that need to be accomplished. This is super useful in Drupal, especially because you can plan ahead your regressions. Regressions are the greatest sources of time, that consume time to go over every functional aspect of the tool. And reducing the amount of regressions by planning ahead and doing these huge clusters of functionality helps reduce the time they take. So it makes the QA time more efficient. And an inherent advantage in this, not only for Drupal, but for all other projects, is that you can get the snapshots of the project each time a version is completed and make sure that you're on track, that you don't need to either extend the timeline or fasten the pace, work on your process to make it faster. And basically tracking your goals. When you do this though, the test plan actually morphs a bit. We saw it in a sort of 3-stage where you start planning, you execute, and you report. When you do this, you're going to have sort of a cycle. There's a process of creating a plan that might have scope from another iteration, and then execute it, report the current state, and start again with the next test plan. This is the basic idea about planning that I'm pitching in this conversation, in this session. And it helps, divide and conquer each of the steps individually, so that you don't get a lot of noise into a very big planning. But planning is still the way to go. Let's talk a bit about specific tips and things that can help you estimate and work on this test plan better. The first topic I'm going to introduce is basically how to work smart with Drupal. There are a lot of advantages of going with a Drupal project that can help QA define a test plan. First one is bug fixing. Usually Drupal is a very stable platform, so there should not be a lot of bugs. But when there are, you need to be intelligent as to how you approach them. You try to focus on fixing things only once and testing only the essential early on. The best way to do this is to prioritize, so you can define the severity of tickets, the crashes and the blockers and the issues that break core functionality need to be fixed. And you need to be able to, from those, prioritize only the ones that need to be fixed up right away and keep moving forward and push tailoring and stability or minor edge cases that need fixing towards the end of the project. So you have most of the things figured out and you're just tailoring instead of just getting it perfect, having it broken later on by another module. That basically is not the idea. And pay special attention to tickets that block testing efforts, because it's very easy to keep on stacking development over faulty functionality. So whenever there's a blocker, you should take immediate care of it. This is to say that for most projects, this approach does not make much sense, because you're doing custom code, and if you're working with a buggy thing, it can eventually haunt you in the future when you try and fix it and you need to go over everything. In Drupal, it makes sort of sense. The only exception would be if you're going into a lot of custom modules and you're writing a lot of custom code, then it's not a good practice to just kick bugs into the future, especially if they're related to the functionality you're touching. But other than that, it makes sense for Drupal. The other thing that is kind of difficult is whenever there's a change request. Usually you should avoid them. They're not good, in essence, but in Drupal, they're specifically problematic because the modules and the way the product is structured is based on the requirement list. And perhaps a new requirement or a change in requirements might break the choice of modules. They could basically include some sort of refactoring, or even worse, you might need to start tweaking and putting custom code into modules to just realize that you're very close to adding another set of modules that could have done it without any custom code. So as usual, you know what to do when a change requirement comes your way, but especially in Drupal. At least try to push them as future enhancement, or try to put them in an icebox and take care of them once you're done, because you first need to deliver and then tailoring should come after. Okay, so now that we've done about the sort of general aspects, let's talk a bit about testing types, which ones are actually good to use on Drupal. And the good thing is that it's an awesome community. There are a lot of official modules, and all the modules come tested out of the box. So there's unit testing and integration testing that goes into publishing them. And that's why I mentioned earlier that it is a stable base platform. And this is something that is incredibly useful for QA efforts. There's little to no downtime. There should be no crashes. There should be no blockers. Instability is not really an issue for Drupal if the developers know what they're doing. So there are a lot of good things that let you keep moving forward even when there are bugs or problems with the system. The testing focus, therefore, should be on verifying requirements to make regressions efficient. And since most of the times there are complex user flows, you should focus on those. And something inherent of Drupal sometimes is performance, especially if you're just adding a bunch of modules without being efficient over it. There might be issues in performance. Let's talk about each of those points. So the first one is requirement verification. For testing, the main ally you have here is good ticket writing. If in the ticket you're explaining the functionality and you have a clear section with an acceptance criteria of all the different traits the functionality needs to accomplish, then it's easy to assess if something has passed or not, especially if you're adding modules that stuck additional functionality over the originally requested. You just need to make sure that you can do whatever the acceptance criteria states. And then, since modules usually touch or connect between each other, or the content is closely related to the users and so on, there needs to be proximity testing. You cannot just say that something is working because you can meet the acceptance criteria. You need to make sure that within the flow or the system, it's still working, everything is working as expected. As far as regressions, so there's no good solution about this. There's no easy solution to this. Usually automation is the way to go, especially for content creation and creating users. There is a lot of technology, or currently the industry standard is using BDDs and testing frameworks, something Selenium based. There are a lot of different phases to this, but all kind of work the same. And when it comes to user flows, the good practice, or again, the industry standard, is to add some sort of gherkin layer over your framework and define the flows in natural language to try and translate requirements into automation tests. The good thing is it provides easy validation that you're actually testing what is expected. And again, it is the current industry standard. When it comes to performance, again, you need to go into automation to get this done, to get some sort of benchmark and some idea of how the project is, the platform is performing. Cache is a good option to make user experience faster, but it might be not enough, especially for admin users that need to work with the platform. They might be experiencing sluggishness, or it just might seem too slow. A good idea, or something that's important to test, is concurrency. It's kind of difficult to test, but if you tweak the framework enough on your proficiency, and you're proficient in automation, you can get it done. Usually the problems go there when there are multiple backend users working on the system at the same time. Either there's problems or there's loss of performance. Another good thing that comes out of this is hardware deficiencies. Usually you deploy these into a server or something of the sort to host the entire thing. And Drupal can be quite, resource hungry. So it's a good practice to just try to get a mock-up of the hardware that's going to be present when this goes live, and try to, make sure that it still works and performs in that particular hardware. Okay, one last thing, and one last challenge, which is just Drupal migration. There's a lot that goes into either going into a different platform or changing the version of Drupal. A lot of handling of code and structures taxonomy, where the media is, where it needs to go, and that's kind of a monster for developers. It's difficult, and each case is special. But for QAs, the good thing is that it's kind of the same thing. You just need to make sure everything looks the same if the designs are going to be kept, and that the content is still there. For visual regression, there's just not a lot that can be said. You just need to either inspect it visually and go over a large portion of data. A good idea is to have some sort of automation visual regression solution, either commercial or something you do yourself, but that will help you identify different error patterns, like stuff missing, panels, and that sort of thing. The other comparison, which is just going through the content It's usually just comparing text elements and media. It's important to not forget alt text. This can also be achieved by automation, but it can be manually inspected for small projects. If you are doing a large-scale data migration, I would not skip automation at any cost, basically because it's inhuman to just go over a big enough sample of data to make sure that the migration has been successful. One last thing before we move on, which is metrics. I didn't want to go over, not stopping here. If your business is metric driven, there are a couple of things that can help you measure the progress of your QA effort in a Drupal project. There are 3 things I suggest you look into, which is basically whenever there's presence of error, it is usually, like I mentioned, related to requirement definition and not to an actual, problem with the code. So you need to make sure that you keep track of those requirements. Load and performance testing is a good way to know if the whole system is being kept in the leash. If there's problems with integrations or modules, usually they will impact the performance. So if you have a good benchmark that you can keep track of, it's a good system of analyzing any instability or any spikes in the system. And ticket quality is essential. Like I mentioned, most of the problems come from requirements. So making sure that the tickets are well written, that they describe everything correctly, that they have a good acceptance criteria that can be objectively assessed is super important. Okay, so let's jump off to the conclusion. What have we talked about so far? So I don't think Drupal is a monster. It's just a very different challenge to what we're used to. The important thing is that you plan ahead and you understand what you're supposed to be doing at every step of the way. There are a lot of things that Drupal does that are great and are good environment for testing. Stability cannot be overrated. It is something that allows you to keep moving forward and keep working with the system even when things are not looking great. And the community and the way the official modules add on strength and additional functionality to the system is also super important. You need to take advantage of these strengths to be able to provide an efficient QA coverage of the system. And finally, my last piece of advice is if you are planning on going through a lot of Drupal projects, or you're aiming to become a Drupal development agency, you need to invest in automation. I don't think there's any way to circle around the benefits that come with automation, and it will be cheaper and more efficient in the long run. As I mentioned, Drupal helps in a lot of areas that are inherently problematic for QA. If you know what areas you will be getting aid at, you will not have any problems with Drupal. And you know that Drupal is not actually a monster. In fact, it was a lovely doggy all along. Any questions?
Thank you, Eduardo. That was great timing. Okay, we have a question in the chat. Danielle asks, where do you like to write requirements and test plans? Word, like Microsoft Word, or Wiki issue tracking system, or a issue, Wiki and issue tracking system, or issue and issue, and she said some other system that's set up for this kind of thing. Go ahead.
Sure. So the important thing I think that document needs to have is the ability to share it with different people. Usually we think of test plans as something just a QA person needs to do, but a lot of information comes from other sources: the client, the requirement list, BRDs, the statement of work. PM needs to fill out of gaps in the system, and it usually taps into the development of the whole thing. So it's important that the dev lead, the PM, and perhaps any other important stakeholder has access to that document. What has really worked for us is because our Moboma works with the Google platform. We have basically docs. We usually use that platform as a sharing or starting point to start gathering data, and it works really great for us.
I'm sorry, you use which to collect the data to where you collect the data?
Basically the Google Suite, online,
Oh,
cloud-based docs
is there particular
and sheets.
Okay, yeah, normal, okay, cool.
Yeah, any
if they have
document
like
that can be shared is more than enough.
Great. So I had a question.
Go for it.
Can you recommend any automated visual regression testing tools?
There are a couple of paid solutions online, a lot. You just need to Google it. As far as if you're having your own custom framework, it will depend on the language it is written. There's Wraith. We use OpenCV for Python. But usually, like, you need to talk to the QA engineer that's currently working if it makes sense to include a certain library or plugin in your current platform, in your current framework, or reach out to a paid solution.
Great. Okay, we've got a question from Kirsten. Are you doing, with test planning, are you doing feature branch testing and documenting the results prior to merges in Git?
That's a great question. In this particular thing, in Drupal especially, if you have this sort of branching out to develop functionality, maybe special tickets or certain things, you not only need to document the state of the branch that you tested, so bugs, issues, but don't forget that when you merge it, you might have conflicts of integration. So you need to pay special attention on the follow-up to the merge of the functionality into the main branch, and make sure you pay special attention to everything that got merged in the next regression or partial regression you make, because that's when you're going to see all the changes being, affecting the platform at the same time. So sort of collisions or concurrency might affect the end stability of the product. You cannot forget about going over stuff that you merged and tested before, later down the line when you're just going over the entire system. Does that make sense?
Kirsten, do you want to reply?
She said
yes. Okay, good.
Yes. Good regression, that's it. If you don't have a dedicated, oh, sorry, Alisa.
Yeah, no, you can read it. As long as you read it out loud, go for it. Yep.
If you don't have a dedicated QA person, what roles usually take this on? That's a great question. I think even if you don't have a dedicated QA person for the project, you should still have a test plan for the project. So at least everyone knows what's supposed to be happening. And then anyone that has a kind of slack can take those tasks. I'd say as far as efficiency and budget, I wouldn't give it to the PM or the lead developer. I would try and get someone that might have some bandwidth to tackle that. Any specific recommendations when the team that builds the site also will do the QA? Think small team of 5 with roles. Okay, so yeah, a small team of developers. Usually you shouldn't invest a lot of time in integration or unit testing if you're using official modules. If you're doing custom code or you're customizing the module, I would add tests to cover what I'm changing. And it's important to stress out that the automation tools used for functional testing, they are, code-based. So you can have developers working on those frameworks if they undergo some training. You could even do TDD at some point if the team is proficient on doing both. They could write the functional test based on the acceptance criteria and the ticket, work on their local branch to accomplish them, and once everything's done, push up not only the code, but also the test cases that automate the functionality being developed. That's, I think, the best way of approaching functional testing with just a developer team. Next question, who has access to the test plans? The development team, if it's government contract, if the contract office in the interval sorry, I need to read it slower. Who has access to the test plans? The development team, if it's a government contract, is it the contracting office or the internal government team? Maybe both. What's the usual path for this that you are using? So this, well, last question, I think, could you clarify a bit? In the meantime, who should have access to the test plans? Everyone. Everyone should be able to check what QA is supposed to be doing or what the testing effort should be. In fact, the test plan, although it usually should not change that much, it is a mutable document, and it can evolve throughout the, you know, the building process. It makes no sense to keep that as a tight leash if, for example, at some point there is another priority on certain functionality that gets brought into the current development. You need to adjust the test plan and make sure that you document what happened and what your target is going to be as far as supporting that new functionality that brings, that sort of breaks the test plan. So it's not set in stone. It is supposed to be a guideline and useful to understand what you're supposed to be doing. Let me see, cool. So if you are on a dev team, you can just ask for this documentation. Yes. In fact, if you started the test plan on the discovery phase, it should be there already. And everyone seeing that can also use it to trigger any questions about stuff that was not thought of. So for example, you're a developer and you had to estimate it a certain, a certain piece of functionality. Then the QA comes and explains the scope of testing. And then you realize that there's some scenario that you hadn't thought of. And that's a good chance of you rethinking your approach on either the estimation needs to be adjusted, or you might need to rethink the way you were going to implement the functionality to cover that scenario. So it also helps the entire team be aware of what's the product gonna be. You're welcome. Is there any question, Allison, in the Slack channel, or a question I missed?
There are no questions in the Slack channel.
I see one that says, what does proximity testing mean to you? That's a great question because I used the term, and it's probably not the correct term if you were to Google it. Proximity testing is something else. What I meant was functionality that is, intertwined with each other. Let's say, for example, you're adding you have a content creation platform and you add a specific module for different user permissions. When you test for user permissions, you will inherently need to take care of, what they're able to do. So if they're able to create certain pieces of content, you're going to have to, make sure that they can only create those pieces of content and nothing else. So closely related functionality. Yeah. Sorry, that was confusing. Thanks, Peter. Yeah, Allison again. Sorry, I was scrolling up.
No, you're good. I'm sorry I missed it.
Oh, no worries. Okay. Keep scrolling up.
Let's give people a few minutes. Sometimes people are shy and we've got time. So.
Oh, no worries.
Excellent time management.
No question. Just saying, hi, Eduardo. Glad I got to hang with you last year at GarbCon. Who is this? Scott Self. Oh, hi, Scott. Thanks for the shout out. With Scott, we did a presentation called 19 Buzzwords to Avoid in 2019. It was great. I had a lot of fun.
Ooh. Is there anything that you'd want to show us for a couple of minutes? It's totally, I know I'm putting you on the spot here. You don't have to at all. And I just said we should just hang tight and wait for questions, so I'm going against what I said, but.
No worries. There's a couple of things I went through super fast. Let's go back just 1 second to the test plan, because it's a very generic concept, the idea of having a test plan. And to be honest, it's a very open document. You need to know what works for you. I think I'm not going the efficient route. There's a drop down here. Yeah, test plan. Actually, this one. it's a very generic concept where you have a document describing what you're gonna do, and then you do it, and then you report of what you did. It's sort of having an initial document and final documents that answer whatever happened. And in essence, it's quite simple, and you can tailor this as much as you want. We talked a bit about how or where to place them. I said that the main advantage of having a shared point or shared document is that everyone can contribute to it. And the second thing I would start thinking of once you are, proficient at creating test plans is there might be some sort of common ground amongst all your efforts. So you can start thinking about creating a template and making the test plan creation effort more efficient. That's actually what we do. We do have different prototypes of test plans that we use for different projects. It helps us understand what questions we need to ask to the client, what information we need to gather before we start. And it sort of goes naturally with this process once you start creating these documents. I see another question here. Are we able to get the slides? I wasn't able to type out everything. Oh, yes, the slides are actually uploaded on the session. You scroll down to the bottom where the Zoom and YouTube links are. There's a link to this presentation as well. Do you have any recommendations of how to document tickets, bug tracking when the team doesn't have sophisticated tracking software? That's a great point. You don't need a sophisticated tracking software to know what goes into it. Usually Jira makes this sort of foolproof. There's a section for certain things that you can add. What I would recommend are that 3 things are always on the ticket. There needs to be a clear description of what you're doing. If there's visual aids, better video documentation, perhaps some interview with the client that he explains the functionality, but you need to describe it as much as possible. And then someone needs to go in there and tailor the acceptance criteria for that particular functionality. So either from the BRDs or a requirement gathering process with the client, but there should be objective statements that functionality needs to pass to be considered acceptable. So there you have it, a description and acceptance criteria. And the third one, it's an optional one, but you should try and estimate how much time it's gonna take, because you're helping out the PM plan ahead how many tickets he'll be able to handle to the team to develop, and also keep track of, is this getting out of hand? And there's a lot of things that you can add on to, so labels, any type of information that is additional to it. There's one thing I want to mention that is quite useful if you're not doing it yet. I said description and acceptance criteria, but there's a process in between. There's the description of the thing you want to develop and the acceptance portion. In the middle, there are a lot of questions about, specific things that are not particularly in the documentation. What we usually do as part of the grooming sessions and as part of our tailoring of tickets is you start with a description and you start building out the acceptance criteria. And then there's a section in between called open questions, or questions for the client, something of the sort, where you start posting all the requirement blanks and stuff that you need to fill out before you close up the acceptance criteria. And this helps out if you're working agile and you have these grooming sessions. You can start working on that in written communication. You don't need to get into the actual meeting. You can forward the product owner or the client the tickets that need tailoring, and he will go through the open questions and try to answer them in the same ticket. And then whenever you're going over the answers, you can start removing the questions and placing that information into the acceptance criteria. And basically the ticket will be completed or well written by the end of it. You will have the description of it and the acceptance criteria with no open question. That sort of tells you that that ticket is ready to be put into a sprint or the board or to start working on it. I know we're on time. Do we have time for the last one?
Yeah, we are at time. You can, let me see if the next speaker, go for it.
Okay, so it says, what type of information or level of detail does the known issue and bug report contain? That's a great question. You first need to define what a known issue is. It depends on the project and what the client or the expectations are. It's stuff that you are releasing the product with. Let's say there's a very edge case with 84 intermediate steps that need to be, executed in order for a minor glitch to be present. So instead of blue, a light blue. That's kind of in the acceptable range if the client is okay with it. So you can release a report when you're done stating these are the known issues that the platform has, and the client agrees to the platform being delivered with those problems. The bug report actually contains everything that was fixed or any bugs that were found that will be fixed in future iterations if you're doing cycles. But basically, bugs, it's just stating a list of things that were found and fixed in the platform. Okay, I think that's the time we have.
Thank you, Eduardo.
You're welcome. I will join the
Thank
Slack
you,
channel
everyone,
just
for attending. Awesome. Yep. Sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say, I'm going to go into the Slack channel to keep on answering questions. Thank you very much for your time. Thanks for having me. Thanks, Allison, for the assistance.
Thank you all.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.